Hi, it's Laura.Marine18. Thanks for stopping by my channel today. Welcome or welcome back. In this video, I will be talking all about books, and in particular, I'll be talking about some science fiction and fantasy books and authors that I have enjoyed. I am predominantly a TarotTube channel, so I know that this will not be of interest to all subscribers, and that is completely fine. But I do love talking about books, and I talk a lot about books in my end of month recap videos. And in the context of those, I've had a few requests to make a video about books in particular and about science fiction and fantasy books especially. I've been asked to talk about my favorite books in these genres or my favorite authors in these genres. And I've also a couple of times been asked to make a video of suggestions of where someone might start who's interested in exploring these genres but hasn't really done so before, doesn't really know where to begin. So in the spirit of particularly those latter kinds of requests, recommendation kinds of requests, I've put together a list of 9 authors who write in science fiction and or fantasy whose work I might recommend to a particular reader depending on what they're looking for. These are not my top 9 authors ever, but they're chosen, with a couple of things in mind. I've picked these 9 and I've restrained myself, and not picked 50 because I don't want to be here all day. I've picked these 9 in the hopes of representing a range. Both science fiction and fantasy are very internally diverse genres in terms of the kinds of styles and the kinds of plot lines that exist. So wanting to give a variety. Not all of these authors will necessarily appeal to all readers. One might really appeal to you and another not at all. They are all quite different. I also wanted to represent a variety of authors in terms of folks who write predominantly novels or write series of novels, trilogies, and so on, and also folks who have written and write novellas or predominantly short fiction, because I like all of those as well. And in terms of making these recommendations more accessible, what I've done is in the description box below linked to a freely available online short story by each of these 9 authors. So if you want to check out someone's work, you don't have to buy anything, just on my suggestion. There are a short story or more by each of these authors available freely online. So I've linked to those ones in the description box below. Some of these authors write predominantly short fiction. One of them I think writes exclusively short fiction, and then others are predominantly novelists who have also published some short fiction. But short fiction is just way more available online freely without getting into like pirating and things like this. So all of the links below are in fact to short stories, but I'll be talking about novels as well. So without further ado, the first novelist I want to speak about is N.K. Jemisin. N.K. Jemisin is a favorite fantasy author of mine. She has published numerous novels, which are all parts of series. So she's published 2 trilogies, including this one, which is the Broken Earth trilogy. She has a 3rd trilogy on the go right now with only 1 book released so far. She's also published a duology of 2 novels that go together, and a book of short stories, which is called How Long Till Black Future Month. And N.K. Jemisin is an incredible fantasy author who, builds worlds that are incredible and compelling and unique and complex, and who tackles power relationships, particularly like very asymmetric power relationships, in interesting ways that are thoughtful and that are also thought-provoking, and just a really good, exciting plot in her books as well. She's the first and only author to win 3 Hugo Awards for Best Novel in a row for 3 books in a trilogy. And that was for this trilogy, which is called the Broken Earth trilogy. The 5th season is the first book in that collection. I first read N.K. Jemisin's Inheritance trilogy, which is her first collection. It's now available as an omnibus in all one book, but it was published, of course, as 3 novels. And I took the first Inheritance trilogy book on vacation with me on my e-reader, and this is back when e-readers were not Wi-Fi capable. I had to plug the e-reader in order to download books. And so I took this first book on vacation. I read it on the beach. I loved it. And I couldn't get the second one. And I was just kicking myself for the entire vacation. Like, why did I not just presume that I would like this and get all three? And of course, I read them as soon as I got home. But I will read anything that N.K. Jemisin publishes. I think her work is fantastic. So for a fantasy author, I would very much suggest checking out N.K. Jemisin's work. And the short story I'm going to link below, The City Born Great, is connected to the trilogy that she's writing now. That one book is out and the other two are forthcoming. It also appears in her short story collection, How Long Till Black Future Months. So you can check that one out below. The second author that I want to talk about, again, also a fantasy author, so far, at least as I've read his work, is J.J. Amaworo Wilson. And he has published 2 novels, Damnificados, this one is the first one, and Nazaré is the second one. And I read Nazaré quite recently, a couple of months ago, I think. And I first came across these, and this book first, because it was published by PM Press. And for folks who aren't familiar with PM Press, they are a political publisher. They publish a lot of anarchist-leaning content. They also publish fiction, though, and this was one of the novels that they published in this series that they have spectacular fiction, and they all have this little yellow tag here. And I read the description on this book, which reads, Damnificados is a loosely based on the real-life occupation of a half-completed skyscraper in Caracas, Venezuela, the Tower of David. In this fictional version, 600 damnificados, vagabonds, and misfits take over an abandoned urban tower and set up a community complete with schools, stores, beauty salons, bakeries, and a ragtag defensive militia. And so begins an epic siege. And that just drew me right in. I thought that just sounded fantastic. And I really enjoy his novels. Both of his novels I would describe as almost whimsical. There are magical realism elements to his work, certainly in his influence. And he deals with certainly, real life issues and serious issues related to, power and oppression and class and these kinds of things. But he also is one of the few authors who consistently makes me laugh aloud when I'm reading his work. Both of his books, Damnificados and Nazaré, deal with kind of uprisings by diverse groups of people in oppressed situations. And this one again is based on a real life. The Tower of David in Caracas is a real tower. This is very much a fantastical version of that. And Nazaré is entirely fictional. And these are a bit, I would say, on the less heavy and intense end of the things that I'm covering in this video. They're, they go there in terms of seriousness, but they're fun and they're funny. And I like the whimsy and the tone of J.J. Amaworo Wilson's style. And he is also someone who writes about language, in his nonfiction publishing life. And so his writing style is really distinctive, and it's a style that I really enjoy. And so I've linked below to Nazaré, a short kind of snippet story connected to his second novel, Nazaré, for you to check out. Really enjoy his work a lot. The third author that I want to talk about is Mary Robinette Kowal. And here to show you, I have a novella called The Forest of Memory by Mary Robinette Kowal. Moment of honesty, I just got this recently and haven't read it yet. This is not super recent. It's not this year, I don't think, 2014. But I picked this up because Mary Robinette Kowal wrote a series, a science fiction series, that I really love called Lady Astronaut of Mars. And Lady Astronaut of Mars is a ongoing series. I'm not sure how many books are envisioned to be in this series total. I think 3 have been published and a 4th is forthcoming at this point. But there are also short stories that tie in to Lady Astronaut of Mars, one of which, called The Lady Astronaut of Mars, that started the series, I've linked below. And Lady Astronaut of Mars is a kind of alternate history science fiction series that's set in the beginning, anyway, in the 1950s. And the first book is The Calculating Stars. And in this book, you know, this is not much of a spoiler because it happens very early on and is probably on the jacket of the book. A meteor hits Earth. And the result of this meteor hitting Earth is that Earth will become uninhabitable in the foreseeable future, like in a matter of decades, due to the warming of the environment caused by this meteor strike. And the main character in The Lady Astronaut of Mars is Alma York, who is a Jewish woman. She's a physicist, and she identifies the ramifications of this meteor strike and the scale of the threat to Earth that this meteor strike poses. And, you know, I'm not usually one for alternate history, honestly, or like historical fiction is not really my genre to go to. But The Lady Astronaut of Mars is really good, and it's a really good take on an accelerated, by necessity, space program starting in the 1950s. So this I would recommend if you, for example, enjoyed the film or the book Hidden Figures. The film had Janelle Monáe and Taraji P. Henson and Octavia Spencer working as calculators for NASA. Then Mary Robinette Kowal's series, The Lady Astronaut of Mars, I think would be one that would appeal for you. You can check out the short story and see. It is I don't want to say it's an easy read, but it's not an overly challenging read. But it is a thought-provoking read in terms of the societal norms and dynamics of the 1950s and this kind of time period in a science fictional context. And I think that is done really, really well. This is a novella that is actually about artificial intelligences and memory. That this is a standalone. This one, again, I haven't read, so I can't say that like I love this, but I'm expecting to enjoy it. But certainly Mary Robinette Kowal's The Lady Astronaut of Mars is a fantastic series, and I definitely recommend starting with the short story below. I've really enjoyed the series, and I'm looking forward to its continuation. The next author I want to talk about, one of my favorites, an author who, you know, anything he puts out, I will pick up for sure, and that's P. Djèlí Clark. And I first read P. Djèlí Clark's work when his novella, which is called The Haunting of Tramcar 015, was nominated for a Hugo Award, and I really enjoyed it. He is now, you know, he's one of my instant buy. If he puts out a book, I'll get it. And P. Djèlí Clark is a historian as well, like an academic working in history, and it really shows in his work, which is fantasy, but it's fantasy set in historical settings that are really kind of permeated with magic, and he comes up with really interesting systems of magic as well. So this book, for example, A Master of Djinn, is set in Cairo in 1912 and follows Fatma el-Sha'arawi, the youngest woman working for the Ministry of Alchemy, Enchantments, and Supernatural Entities. And this is part of a series that starts with a short story called A Dead Djinn in Cairo. And that short story is available online, so I'm going to link it below. The Dead Djinn in Cairo story comes first, then is The Haunting of Tramcar 015, the novella, and then this one. So the short story that I've linked below also follows Agent Fatma, who is the protagonist in this book. I love this series. I don't know if there's planned to be more, but I really hope so. Also, look at how beautiful, and this is metallic. Look at how beautiful this is. I love this series, and aside from just being an interesting fantasy series with an interesting setting and great magic and an exciting fantasy adventure plot line, following this kind of fantastical investigations, I have to recommend Djèlí Clark as a author who I think, and there's very few that I will say this about, who is a male author who writes female characters that I'm excited about. Agent Fatma is amazing. He writes female protagonists in a number of his books, not just in this series, but in others as well, who are complex and multifaceted and who feel real and who feel relatable. And he writes their relationships, including relationships between queer women, in ways that I look for, that I really look for. And I am grateful for that. I really value books like this for that kind of representation, as well as just being great fantasy books. This is highly recommend Djèlí Clark's historical fantasy, fantastical histories, amazing adventures in his books. Highly recommend. The next author I want to talk about is a hard one to talk about because his work is so varied. It's hard to describe his style, and that is China Miéville. This is a novella that was a Hugo-nominated novella, This Census Taker. He's also written numerous novels, including a trilogy as well as a number of standalones. He's published 2 short fiction collections, I believe, one of which is this one, Looking for Jake. This might be a good place to start for folks who are curious about his work. He has described planning to write a book in every genre, right, that he can. And so it's really hard to make generalizations about what his books are like, because they really do have a lot of range. He's associated with a literary current, we'll say, which is called the New Weird. And New Weird blends science fiction and fantasy as well as horror. So part of the reason that I'm including China Miéville on this list is because he's someone who might appeal to readers who like horror but are interested in stepping into something like a science fiction or fantasy. I'm not a huge horror reader myself, but his take on horror elements works for me, particularly in this one. This book is creepy. It is a book that is it's almost all atmosphere. It's very obscure. It's very strange, and you're not given a lot of information about what's going on. The book jacket does tell you, in a remote house on a hilltop, a lonely boy witnesses a profoundly traumatic event. He tries and fails to flee. Left alone with his increasingly deranged parent, he dreams of safety and of joining the other children in the town below, of escape. When at last a stranger knocks at his door, the boy senses his days of isolation might be over. But by what authority does this man keep the meticulous records he carries? What is the purpose behind his questions? Is he a friend, an enemy, or something else altogether? And it's described as filled with beauty, terror, and strangeness. This census taker is a poignant and riveting exploration of memory and identity. And this is a standalone. And, if you want a recommendation for this, on the back of the book, Ursula Le Guin herself writes, Miéville's wit dazzles, his humor is lively, and the pure vitality of his imagination is astonishing. This is not humorous, not even a little bit. This is a really intense read. The New Weird as a kind of sci-fi fantasy horror is very different than a lot of other fantasy. The settings tend to be very urban, very contemporary. It is more realistic city settings. He has a trilogy called the Baslag trilogy that starts with Perdido Street Station is the first book, The Scar is the second, and The Iron Council is the third. Personally, the second 2 are better than the first, my opinion. And the city of New Crabozone that he creates in that series is, you can smell the city in the way he describes it. It doesn't smell good, but it's very evocative, and it's a whole world. The Baslag world, is represented in this short story book as well. Is this whole world of strange species of like cactus people and eagle people and mosquito people, and these all of these kind of very unusual, viscerally described species that live in these big complex cities. And it is it leans into the grotesque, that trilogy in a number of respects. I thought it was really good. It's very different than anything else on this list. He writes really alien aliens. His novel Embassy Town, which is all about language, is really great in that respect. He has a kind of a crime fiction called The City and the City, which is also the basis of a 4-part miniseries, which is really good. Really interesting. Again, very, I don't want to say inconsistent, because inconsistent like sounds bad, but his works are very different from each other. So it's hard to generalize. If you would like to ask me about any of his books, I've read almost all of them, feel free. I'm recommending Covehithe, a short story that was published in The Guardian, so you can get some sense of what his writing style is like. I appreciate his massive vocabulary when I read his books as well. That's something else that stands out. So again, a very unusual an eclectic author, China Miéville, whose work I find really interesting and creepy in many instances, is another one that I would suggest checking out. Next up is Martha Wells. And folks, may know that I love Martha Wells' Murderbot series. And Martha Wells is a prolific author. She has written a fantasy series. The first book, The Cloud Roads, in her fantasy series is very high on my list to read. N.K. Jemisin gave it 5 stars, so, I have high expectations. But Murderbot is the series of Martha Wells that I know. She also has another fantasy series coming out, I think in 2023, maybe late this year, but I think it's 2023, starting with The Witch King. Murderbot is mostly comprised of novellas, as well as this novel. There are some short stories in the Murderbot series as well, including Home, Habitat, Range, Niche, Territory, which I'm going to link below. If you haven't read Murderbot, like this one, I'm just going to recommend to everybody. Murderbot is so good. And, the quote on the front of the book from NPR says, "This is one of the most human experiences you can have in science fiction." N.K. Jemisin wrote the blurb at the top of the novel. Martha Wells is the best writer of lovable, snarky, gender-subversive killing machines out there. And the lovable, snarky, gender-subversive killing machine is, in fact, Murderbot. And Murderbot is the kind of narrator of the stories. And Murderbot is a security unit, who has hacked its own kind of control module, and so now is autonomous and self-directing. And it is one of the most interesting first-person point of view internal monologues that I have read maybe ever. It's fresh and it's funny and it's heartwarming, and funny is not a thing that I usually go for, but honestly, like, everybody should just read Murderbot. Everybody should read Murderbot and start with the first novella, and then the second novella, and then the third novella, and then eventually get to here. Or if you want to, you can start with a short story that I've mentioned below. But this is so good and so much fun, and is a place, if you're completely new to science fiction, the short story and the first novella in the Murderbot series is an accessible place to start, I would say. It's really fun, and I cannot recommend the Murderbot series highly enough. And if you're into fantasy more than science fiction, you could check out The Cloud Roads again, which is Martha Wells' first fantasy novel or the first in a series rather. Again, I haven't read it, but I'm happy to just assume that it's great. So check out Martha Wells. She has many, many books, many standalone novels, several series, but like Murderbot is where it's at in terms of contemporary science fiction, in my opinion. My partner and I wait for these to come out, and we both get them and we read them together and we laugh about them together. And so good. Check out Murderbot. The next author I have to talk about, and I have only 3 left, making good time, I think. The next author I want to talk about is Tochi Onyebuchi. And I first encountered Tochi Onyebuchi's work in the Short Story Club, which was a kind of program, I guess, where you could sign up to be in the Short Story Club, and they would mail you by email a short story, and then there would be a Zoom with the author. So I went to a couple of these. I went to one with Martha Wells, I went to one with Mary Robinette Kowal, and I went to one with Tochi Onyebuchi, and he was great. And I hadn't read any of his work at that point, except for the short story that they had sent us, which I thoroughly enjoyed. It's not the short story I've linked below, because the one that they sent us was out of an anthology, so I can't get it in a copyright friendly way to post here. But part of the reason I think I hadn't come across his work so much is because several of his earlier works are YA, and I generally, I don't read YA. I've read very, very little of it, but he's written a number of YA books. He also wrote the novella Riot Baby, which is up for the Hugo and the Locus this year, and won the World Fantasy Award for novella this year. Congratulations. And Riot Baby is very much an adult novella following a man who's wrongfully incarcerated, and his sister has magical powers in this story. He also, for adults, has written Goliath, and this just came out. This came out in January. It was one of the top books on my list. I got it as an ebook, and then I went and bought the hardcover because it's beautiful, and I wanted it on my shelf. I don't have Riot Baby in hardback either, but I wanted one of his books on my shelf for sure. And this is really good. This is, I would say, on the literary end of science fiction. It is not particularly linear. It reads, and some people have kind of given it a lower rating for this reason. For me, it's not a criticism at all. In some ways, it reads more like a series of kind of vignettes or short stories that are all set in the same world than it does one plot going through the entire novel. It's almost like, this is a world being seen from a handful of very different perspectives, and each perspective is going to tell you about what's going on from their perspective at this time, is kind of more so the structure. And this is really good. So I'll just read the description, the brief description of this very recent novel. In the 2050s, Earth has begun to empty. Those with the means and the privilege have departed the great cities of the United States for the more comfortable confines of space colonies. Those left behind salvage what they can from the collapsing infrastructure. As they eke out an existence, their neighborhoods are being cannibalized. Brick by brick, their houses are sent to the space colonies, what was once a home, now a quaint reminder for the colonists of the world that they wrecked. A primal biblical epic flung into the future, Goliath weaves together disparate narratives. A space dweller looking at New Haven, Connecticut as a chance to reconnect with a spiraling lover, a group of laborers attempting to renew the promises of Earth-crumbling cities, a journalist attempting to capture the violence of the streets, a marshal trying to solve a kidnapping. Into a richly urgent mosaic about race, class, gentrification, and who is allowed to be the hero in any story. This is current. I mean, it's only halfway through 2022. So, there's lots of more books to come. But as of now, this is my best novel Hugo pick for next year of anything that I've read in 2022. It is not an easy read. It is confronting. It comes with a lot of content warnings. It is challenging. It's challenging stylistically. It is so well done. This is so well done. I cannot recommend this more highly, with the note that it is a challenging read to get through. I would check out some content warnings for this. But Tochi Onyebuchi's work is amazing. And I would say, if you're more of a YA reader, check out his YA work. I haven't read it personally, but I know folks really love it. So do check those out. And I've linked below to a short story by Tochi Onyebuchi, A Room of One's Own, that you can check out as well. Next up, another favorite. I like all of these. This is a favorite. Ted Chiang. This is Ted Chiang's book, Stories of Your Life and Others. He also has another short story collection called Exhalation. Ted Chiang is exclusively a short fiction author. He is, in my mind, absolutely, without question, the best short story writer in these genres right now. Full stop. That's my opinion. He has not published as many books as a lot of other folks on this list. He has this and one other collection of short stories. But those two collections, there is not one bit of filler in either one. Every story is good. They range widely from being, very short stories to, I would say, novella length. He explains his inspirations for the story. He puts story notes at the back of the books in a way that I really appreciate. I like hearing the thought process of where the idea came from, particularly with very unique stories like this. Folks who haven't read Ted Chiang may still be familiar with his work insofar as the book, the story called Stories of Your Life, which is in this one, was made into the film Arrival with Amy Adams and Forrest Whitaker. So if you've seen Arrival, that is based on a story by Ted Chiang, which is in this collection. This collection and Exhalation, I would say, are equally good. They're 5-star collections, both, in my opinion. There's not one, usually with short story collections, like particularly anthologies, but even short story collections by a single author, usually I'll say, there's some 5-star stories and there's some 3-star stories and there's something in between and some are better than others. Ted Chiang's are just all good. Like there's not a bad one in the bunch. And they have quite a range in terms of the themes and the style. They're very much kind of thought-provoking stories, absolutely. But for the most part, they are thought-provoking without feeling extraordinarily heavy. Many of them do have quite a sense of humor, which I appreciate as well. So for fans of short fiction, if you have not read Ted Chiang yet, go and do that. You will enjoy it. And I'm linking below to Lightspeed Magazine, which published Exhalation, which of course is in the collection called Exhalation. I cannot recommend Ted Chiang's short fiction highly enough. It is excellent. It is unparalleled excellent in my opinion. So good. So particularly for science fiction, check out Ted Chiang's collections. And finally, the last author that I'm going to include in this list, and again, I could have gone on forever. I could have picked so many. I've limited myself trying to keep this video a reasonable length. The last author I want to talk about is Ann Leckie. And Ann Leckie has written predominantly science fiction. This book, Ancillary Justice, is the first in a trilogy. And then she has also written another novel that's a standalone in the same universe as this, so another science fiction novel. And she has one fantasy novel, which is called Raven Tower, which I've also read and I also really liked. Raven Tower as a fantasy does really interesting things, I think, with time. It has characters in this fantasy with very different lifespans, because, there's kind of god characters and human characters. And that is handled in a way that I think is really, really interesting. It's also written in second person. N.K. Jemisin does a lot of second person. I know some people are like, really no on the second person. I can appreciate it when it's done well, and Ann Leckie and N.K. Jemisin both certainly do it well. But this book, Ancillary Justice, and the trilogy in particular, like as a whole, I really, really highly recommend. This book, it's noted on the front that it's the Hugo and Nebula award-winning novel. This one won the Hugo, the Nebula, the Arthur C. Clarke, the Locus, and the BSFA all in one swoop. This was a big, swept the awards, right? And I think that it's very well deserved. This is all of the things that I want in a space opera. And I haven't talked about any in the space opera terms yet, but this is space opera for 2022, and in a way that I really appreciate and want. It has all of the kind of political maneuvering and interest that I want, with all of the action that I want. with complicated kind of questions posed by technology and artificial intelligence and technological control that I want. It asks those questions, and it does interesting things stylistically, while having all of that not at the expense of having a good plot. And really briefly, what this is kind of structured around. It explains on the back of the book, on a remote icy planet, the soldier known as Breck is drawing closer to completing her quest. Once she was the Justice of Torin, a colossal starship with an artificial intelligence linking thousands of soldiers in the service of the Raj, the empire that conquered the galaxy. So the protagonist, Breck, is essentially an artificially intelligent human body, kind of, or not an artificially intelligent. That's a wrong way to put it. In this book, AI, artificially intelligent conscious ships, have networked into them soldiers that are constructed from human bodies. Like, the closest thing that I can think of is the Borg. So if you're familiar with the Borg, this gives like some amount of context to this. It's not the same thing, but that's the best I can give you. And Breck is the one remaining surviving soldier after the ship that links all of the soldiers is destroyed. And so this follows a really interesting first-person protagonist as well, in ways that I think are really novel. I also will mention that Anne Leckie does really interesting things with gender in this book, in that the language spoken by the empire in this book, the main empire in this book, their language doesn't distinguish gender. It has no gendered reference in it. But then other languages in the books do. So there are these moments of like people who are unfamiliar with gendered language trying to navigate gendered language, and people who are only familiar with very gendered languages trying to navigate a non-gendered language. And this is really interesting, really, really interesting. And this is I'm not gonna say it's a difficult one in some ways. It's not one that's just gonna give everything to you. It is one that takes some thought and is one to be read slowly, I think. It's also one that I will happily reread. I intend to reread this trilogy. It was really good. My brother got me this for Christmas once, years ago, and it was a really good read. The whole trilogy is good. But I'll also say if space opera is not your thing, then The Raven Tower and Leckie's fantasy novel might be your thing instead. It's also very good. She does both genres and does them quite distinctly. Like, her fantasy novel is not sci-fi fantasy mix, it's fantasy. Her sci-fi is sci-fi. So those are quite distinct. She does both very well. And so a very interesting author. And I've linked below a short story called Night's Slow Poison by Anne Leckie that you can check out. There used to be a 2-part short story set in this universe available online for free, called She Commands and I Obey. You can search for that and find the first half. The second half, the link seems to be broken. Otherwise, I would have suggested that short story because this series is fantastic. Check it out. So I hope that this has given folks who are interested in science fiction and fantasy reading or checking out some sci-fi fantasy authors some places to start. Feel free to tell me in the comments below some of your favorite sci-fi fantasy books or authors, whether classic or contemporary. If there's any that you think that I would like, that you would like to recommend to me, please do so. I have definitely read and enjoyed books that folks have recommended in the comments before. I have a never-ending TBR list at this point, that is longer than I will ever get through in my lifetime, but I'm happy to keep growing it when folks recommend different books for me to read. So let me know what you think. And if you've read any of the authors that I've mentioned and have thoughts about them, let me know those as well. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day, and I will see you again soon, probably with some tarot or divination content.